You've been lied to about what makes a man successful and fulfilled, and the proof is walking around everywhere you look. Broken men who sacrificed their potential for romantic validation and ended up with neither love nor achievement. Immanuel Kant, arguably the most logically rigorous philosopher in human history, saw this trap clearly and made a choice that will shock you. He avoided women completely for his entire life, not because he was afraid of rejection or socially awkward, but because he understood something about human nature and success that most men never realize until it's too late. What Kant discovered about the true cost of romantic relationships will fundamentally change how you think about dating, marriage, and what it really means to live as a rational man in an irrational world. Immanuel Kant lived like a human metronome. His daily routine was so precise that the people of Königsberg could literally set their clocks by his afternoon walks. He woke at 5 a.m. every single day, ate the same meals at identical times, took his constitutional at exactly 3:30 p.m. along the same route. This wasn't just quirky behavior. This was a man who understood that chaos in your external life creates chaos in your mind. While other men were chasing women and getting their hearts broken, Kant was building an unshakable foundation of discipline that would produce some of history's most influential ideas. This mechanical precision wasn't about being boring. It was about being free. When you eliminate the unpredictable variables from your life, especially the emotional roller coaster of romantic relationships, you create space for your mind to operate at its highest level. Kant recognized that every minute spent worrying about what some woman thinks of you is a minute stolen from your potential greatness. He saw other men constantly adjusting their schedules, their goals, their very personalities to accommodate the whims and demands of relationships. Meanwhile, his structured life gave him complete control over his time and mental energy. The brutal truth is that Kant's machine-like existence produced more lasting value than the romantic adventures of 1,000 other men combined. While his contemporaries were writing love letters and dealing with relationship drama, Kant was revolutionizing philosophy and laying the groundwork for modern ethics. His routine wasn't a prison. It was a fortress that protected his mission from the distractions that derail most men's ambitions. He understood that true freedom isn't doing whatever you feel like. It's having the discipline to do what serves your highest purpose. Kant's entire philosophy rested on one radical idea: your feelings are lying to you. He believed that the moment you start making decisions based on what feels good, you've surrendered your humanity to your animal instincts. This wasn't just abstract philosophy. This was a practical blueprint for living that he applied ruthlessly to relationships. While other men were falling in love and making life-altering decisions based on butterflies in their stomach, Kant was asking the hard question: what does duty demand of me right now? He saw romantic desire as the enemy of moral clarity, a drug that makes you stupid and weak. The categorical imperative, Kant's famous moral test, essentially asks, what if everyone did what you're about to do? Apply this to modern dating and you'll see why Kant avoided it completely. If every man spent his prime years chasing women instead of building himself, society would collapse into mediocrity. If every man made major life decisions based on impressing some girl, we'd have a world full of broken dreams and abandoned purposes. Kant understood that following your desires feels good in the moment, but leads to long-term misery and regret. This is why Kant lived by duty rather than desire, why he chose obligation over emotion every single time. He knew that feelings are temporary but principles are eternal. When you base your life on what you want rather than what you should do, you become a slave to impulses that will inevitably change and leave you empty. Duty might not give you the immediate pleasure of romance, but it gives you something far more valuable: self-respect and unshakable moral foundation. Kant's categorical imperative states that you should only act according to principles you'd want everyone to follow universally. Apply this brutal test to modern dating and watch the whole system crumble before your eyes. When you swipe right on dating apps, ask yourself, what if every man did this? When you lie to impress a woman, consider, what if dishonesty became the universal dating strategy? When you abandon your goals to spend more time with someone, imagine, what if every man sacrificed his mission for romance? The answer is always the same: society would become weaker, more dishonest, more pathetic. This moral framework makes genuine romantic pursuit nearly impossible because most dating behavior fails the universality test completely. You can't ethically play games, manipulate emotions, or present a false version of yourself because you wouldn't want to live in a world where everyone did these things. You can't even engage in casual hookups without violating the principle that humans should be treated as ends in themselves, not merely as means to your physical satisfaction. Kant saw that modern dating culture turns people into objects for consumption, rather than respecting their inherent dignity and worth. The categorical imperative reveals why Kant avoided women entirely. He couldn't participate in a system that violated his core moral principles. Every romantic strategy, from pickup lines to emotional manipulation, fails his ethical test. He chose moral consistency over romantic fulfillment because he understood that compromising your principles for temporary pleasure destroys your character. Most men never realize they're participating in a morally bankrupt system that makes everyone involved less human and less worthy of respect. Kant had perhaps the most brutally honest view of marriage in philosophical history. He saw it as nothing more than a legal contract for mutual sexual access. In his work, The Metaphysics of Morals, he argued that marriage exists primarily to make sexual relations morally permissible. By creating reciprocal rights over each other's bodies, this wasn't romantic, it was transactional. While other philosophers waxed poetic about love and companionship, Kant stripped away the illusions and saw marriage for what it really is, an institutional arrangement designed to regulate human sexuality and property transfer. This cold analysis revealed why Kant never married. He refused to reduce himself or another person to a sexual commodity. He understood that the moment you enter into marriage, you're essentially signing a contract that says you own access to someone's body, and they own access to yours. For a man who believed in human dignity above all else, this was morally repugnant. He couldn't participate in an institution that turned the highest expression of human autonomy into a legal obligation. Marriage, in Kant's view, was incompatible with treating people as ends in themselves rather than means to an end. Modern men who understand Kant's perspective might find themselves questioning the entire institution of marriage differently. If you're honest about what marriage contracts actually entail, you realize you're signing away fundamental freedoms in exchange for social approval and regular sex. Kant saw through the romantic rhetoric to the underlying reality. Marriage is a business arrangement disguised as a love story. He chose to remain free rather than become a willing participant in what he saw as legalized mutual exploitation. Kant understood something that destroys most men. Emotional attachment makes you stupid. When you develop feelings for someone, your rational mind gets hijacked by neurochemical chaos that clouds your judgment and compromises your decision-making ability. He observed how men in love became different people, abandoning their principles, ignoring red flags, and making choices they would never make in their right minds. Emotional attachment creates psychological dependency that turns grown men into needy children, desperate for validation and approval from someone who holds their happiness hostage. The philosopher recognized that romantic feelings operate like a drug addiction, creating artificial highs and devastating lows that have nothing to do with reality. When you're emotionally attached, you start interpreting neutral behavior as signs of love, making excuses for treatment you would never accept from friends, and sacrificing your own needs to keep someone else happy. Your entire emotional state becomes dependent on another person's moods and actions, which means you've surrendered control over your own psychological well-being to someone else's whims. This is why Kant maintained strict emotional distance from romantic entanglements. He valued his mental clarity too much to risk it on the emotional roller coaster of attachment. He saw that men who get emotionally invested lose their ability to think objectively about the relationship, about their partner's character, and about their own best interests. Emotional attachment turns rational adults into irrational creatures driven by fear of loss, rather than pursuit of genuine happiness. Kant chose intellectual freedom over emotional bondage because he understood that clear thinking requires emotional independence. Kant viewed romantic relationships as fundamental obstacles to intellectual achievement and moral development. He observed that men who pursued women consistently sacrificed their higher pursuits for the immediate gratification of female attention and approval, while his male contemporaries spent countless hours writing love letters, planning romantic gestures, and navigating the complex social dynamics of courtship. Kant was developing revolutionary ideas about ethics, knowledge, and human nature. He understood that every minute spent trying to impress a woman was a minute stolen from the work that would define his legacy and contribute to human understanding. The philosopher recognized that women represented a unique form of distraction because they engaged both the emotional and physical aspects of male nature simultaneously. Unlike other distractions that might occupy your time, romantic pursuit hijacks your entire psychological system, making you constantly preoccupied with someone else's thoughts, feelings, and reactions. Kant saw how this preoccupation made men lose focus on their missions, their principles, and their potential contributions to society. He watched brilliant men become mediocre because they redirected their mental energy toward gaining and maintaining female approval rather than pursuing excellence in their chosen fields. This wasn't misogyny, this was strategic life design based on understanding human psychology and the finite nature of mental resources. Kant chose to channel his intellectual and emotional energy into philosophy rather than relationships because he recognized that greatness requires singular focus. He understood that you cannot serve two masters. You cannot pursue both romantic conquest and intellectual achievement at the highest level. Most men never realize they're making this choice until it's too late and their potential has been squandered on temporary pleasures. Kant discovered what modern men are just beginning to understand. Single men possess a fundamental advantage in moral reasoning and life decisions. Without the emotional complications of romantic relationships, bachelors can evaluate situations based purely on rational principles, rather than how their choices might affect a partner's feelings or relationship dynamics. Kant observed that married men constantly compromise their moral positions to maintain domestic peace, while single men remain free to act according to their conscience without external pressure or emotional manipulation affecting their judgment. The bachelor's life offers complete autonomy over time, resources, and decision-making that married men simply cannot access. When Kant wanted to spend 14 hours a day working on his critique of pure reason, he didn't need to negotiate with anyone or justify his priorities when he chose to maintain his rigid daily schedule. No one could guilt him into abandoning his routine for social obligations or emotional needs. This freedom allowed him to achieve intellectual breakthroughs that would have been impossible if he had been managing the constant demands and distractions of a romantic partnership. Single men also avoid the moral compromises that relationships inevitably demand, from small lies to keep the peace to major life decisions influenced by someone else's preferences, rather than rational analysis. Kant understood that moral clarity requires independence from emotional manipulation and social pressure. The bachelor maintains his integrity because he doesn't need to balance his principles against someone else's happiness or expectations. This moral advantage explains why many of history's greatest philosophers, scientists, and innovators remain single. They recognized that their mission required the kind of focus that romantic relationships systematically destroy. Kant understood that true freedom isn't the ability to do whatever you want. It's the power to make decisions based solely on rational principles without external coercion or emotional manipulation. His chosen isolation from romantic relationships preserved the most precious form of human autonomy, the freedom to think clearly and act according to moral duty rather than social expectations or another person's desires. While other men found themselves constantly negotiating their choices with partners, explaining their decisions, and modifying their behavior to maintain relationship harmony, Kant remained completely sovereign over his own life and choices. This isolation protected Kant's decision-making process from the subtle but powerful influence that romantic partners inevitably exert on each other. In relationships, your choices become filtered through questions like, will this upset her? How will this affect us? What will she think of me if I do this? These considerations might seem reasonable, but they fundamentally compromise your ability to act based purely on what you believe is right and rational. Kant recognized that once you start making decisions to please someone else or maintain a relationship, you've surrendered your moral agency to external forces beyond your control. The philosopher's isolation also preserved his mental energy for the highest forms of human activity: contemplation, analysis, and creative thinking, without the emotional labor of managing another person's feelings, needs, and expectations. Kant could dedicate his full intellectual capacity to understanding fundamental questions about reality, morality, and human nature. His chosen solitude wasn't loneliness. It was liberation from the countless small compromises that gradually erode a man's character and dilute his potential for greatness. Kant calculated the true price of romantic companionship and decided it was too expensive for any rational man to pay, beyond the obvious financial costs of dating, marriage, and family. He recognized the hidden expenses that destroy most men's potential: the constant emotional labor of managing another person's feelings, the mental energy wasted on relationship maintenance, and the opportunity costs of time that could be spent on meaningful work. While other men were investing decades into keeping their wives happy, Kant was investing that same energy into ideas that would outlast any marriage and benefit all of humanity. The philosopher understood that companionship demands continuous sacrifice of your authentic self. To maintain harmony with another person, you start editing your thoughts, moderating your opinions, and suppressing aspects of your personality that might create conflict or displeasure over time. These small compromises accumulate into a complete loss of individual identity as you become a curated version of yourself designed to be acceptable to your partner. Kant refused to pay this price because he valued his intellectual integrity more than social validation or emotional comfort. Most devastating of all, Kant saw how companionship creates psychological dependency that weakens men's capacity for independent thought and action. When you become accustomed to sharing decisions, seeking approval, and considering another person's perspective before acting, you gradually lose the ability to trust your own judgment and act with confidence. The man who once made bold decisions based on his principles becomes hesitant and uncertain, always second-guessing himself and looking for external validation. Kant chose the temporary loneliness of solitude over the permanent weakness of codependency. Kant's avoidance of women wasn't misogyny. It was the ultimate act of rational self-preservation by a man who understood his own nature and limitations. He recognized that romantic involvement would inevitably compromise his philosophical mission and corrupt his moral clarity. So he made the difficult choice to protect his higher purpose from his lower impulses. This wasn't about hating women. It was about loving his work and his principles more than temporary pleasures or social expectations. Kant understood that every man must choose between serving his mission or serving his desires, and he chose his mission without hesitation or regret. The philosopher practiced what he preached about: treating people as ends in themselves, rather than means to an end. By avoiding romantic relationships, he refused to use women for emotional satisfaction, physical pleasure, or ego validation. He also refused to allow women to use him for financial security, social status, or emotional support. This mutual avoidance protected both parties from the exploitation and manipulation that characterize most romantic relationships, where people pretend to love each other while actually using each other to meet their own needs. Kant's rational self-preservation extended beyond just avoiding relationships to creating a life structure that maximized his potential for meaningful contribution to human knowledge. He understood that greatness requires sacrifice, and he was willing to sacrifice companionship, romantic love, and family life to achieve something far more valuable: intellectual legacy that would benefit generations of people he would never meet. His choice to prioritize reason over romance demonstrates the highest form of self-respect and commitment to human flourishing. Kant's radical choice to avoid women completely reveals a profound truth that most men never consider: the greatest achievements in human history often require the greatest personal sacrifices. While society tells you that romantic relationships are necessary for happiness and fulfillment, Kant proved that a man can live a deeply meaningful life by choosing intellectual pursuit over emotional entanglement. His philosophical contributions continue to influence how we think about morality, knowledge, and human dignity centuries after his death. While the romantic relationships of his era are forgotten dust, perhaps the real question isn't whether Kant was right to avoid women, but whether modern men have the courage to prioritize their mission over their emotions. Are you willing to make the hard choices that separate greatness from mediocrity? Or will you remain trapped in the comfortable mediocrity of seeking validation through romantic relationships? If this perspective on relationships and personal development resonates with you, subscribe to the channel for more philosophical insights that challenge conventional wisdom about success, purpose, and what it really means to live as a rational human being.